Welcome to the DRS zone. We are so hyped to get into this today, but first, just a quick note. This segment is part of our news coverage of recent F1 events.
Absolutely. And, man, do we have some intense events to cover today.
You can say that again. We are diving into a stack of fresh sources today. We've got incredibly detailed telemetry data, deep race analysis, and raw paddock commentary, because we need to talk about the absolute seismic shift that just hit the motorsport world.
I mean, it is a completely new era. The debut of the radically new 2026 Formula One regulations at the Australian Grand Prix. The entire paddock is still reeling. Engineers, drivers, the media, everyone is scrambling to process what we just witnessed on that asphalt.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is to cut straight through that noise, cut through the emotional reactions, and figure out the truth. Is this chaotic, unpredictable weekend the thrilling, action-packed future of racing? Or is it just some flawed artificial experiment gone totally wrong? And most importantly, we are going to translate all this highly technical jargon into what it actually means for you as a viewer. So we got to jump right in. We have to start with the biggest, most explosive talking point of the weekend, the cars themselves. The reactions were incredibly polarized.
Totally polarized. And to understand why the grid is so divided right now, we really have to ground ourselves in the fundamental philosophy of these 2026 regs. The big picture here is that these cars are now heavily, almost entirely dependent on battery power.
Yeah, the internal combustion engine is still there behind the driver, but it feels like the electrical component is the absolute dictator of the lap now.
It is. It's shifted from this sport of pure aerodynamic grip, throwing it into a corner, to a sport of intense, continuous energy management. You are constantly making a brutal trade-off. Do I deploy my electrical energy right now to attack, or do I harvest it so I'm not totally stranded on the next straight?
It's crazy. And I was looking at the raw passing data from our sources, and it's a really confusing picture. On paper, it says there were 120 overtakes this race.
Which is a massive number.
Right. Compared to just 45 at Melbourne last year. So you hear that stat and you think, wow, this is the most action-packed, aggressive era of racing ever. But watching the actual broadcast, it did not feel like 120 hard-fought battles. What were we actually seeing out there?
That is the exact discrepancy everyone is arguing about. The data says one thing, the eyeballs say another. It didn't feel like traditional racing because the actual mechanics of an overtake have fundamentally changed.
How so?
Well, a lot of those 120 passes felt more like a highly engineered cat-and-mouse game. It wasn't a driver bravely outbraking a rival into turn one. The electrical deployment is so incredibly potent now, but it's fleeting. So drivers use a specific boost mode to just blast past the car ahead.
But doing that drains their battery reserves instantly, right?
Almost instantly, yes.
Right.
They make the pass, but now they're completely running on empty.
So they're immediately vulnerable.
Exactly. The driver who just got passed doesn't even fight it. They just sit there, wait for the next DRS zone or the next straight, activate their own fully charged boost mode, and breeze right back past.
Oh, man.
It creates this massively inflated overtake statistic. But the passes themselves completely lack that wheel-to-wheel tension we love.
Which perfectly explains Lando Norris's reaction. I mean, our sources highlight a blistering critique from him. He flat out called the racing artificial. He even suggested this might be the worst era F1 has ever seen. You could hear the frustration about just not being able to defend his position.
And you can't blame him. His frustration is rooted in that exact energy deficit. If you are in a harvesting phase to recharge your battery, and the guy behind you is in a deployment phase, your defensive driving skills are useless. You could be Senna, and it wouldn't matter.
Right.
Ollie Bierman actually gave a striking analogy for this. He said when a rival deployed their power, it felt like he was driving a Formula 2 car while they were in a Formula 1 car.
That is a brutal comparison.
It is. The extra energy arrives in such a narrow, aggressive window that if you don't have the battery to match it, you are a sitting duck. Bierman even went as far as saying it felt like Formula E, not F1, and Esteban Ocon completely backed that up, calling the whole experience painful.
But then, and this is where it gets fascinating, you look at the other side of the grid, and some guys were absolutely thriving. Lewis Hamilton came out swinging, saying he loved the Grand Prix, said he felt connected to the car again.
Yeah, he looks rejuvenated.
And Charles Leclerc and George Russell were framing the whole thing as high-speed chess. So how on earth can drivers in the exact same regulation cars have such radically different takeaways?
I think it comes down to what a driver genuinely values in the cockpit. Drivers like Norris, they thrive on pure, reactive, instinctual racing, the physical battle. But guys like Russell and Leclerc, they are really leaning into the cerebral challenge here.
The strategy of it.
Precisely. They appreciate the strategic depth. You can't just drive on raw instinct anymore. You have to plan your energy usage 3, 4, 5 laps in advance. You're anticipating where your rival is going to be vulnerable 3 corners from now, and you hoard your battery for that exact millisecond. It's a highly analytical, almost mathematical way to race.
Which is awesome for them, but it brings us to a massive problem for you, the fan tuning in on a Sunday. If this is a high-speed chess match of invisible energy reserves, how are we supposed to follow it?
We can't. Not right now.
Right. The TV broadcasts currently do not have the graphical overlays to show us who is deploying power and who is saving it.
And that is a critical flaw in the presentation of the sport. The broadcast technology simply hasn't caught up to the complexity of the 2026 regulations. Without those telemetry graphics showing the battery levels, the entire narrative of the race is stripped away.
It really is. To the viewer, it just looks like a car inexplicably slows down and gives up a position.
Exactly. You aren't seeing the brilliant, multi-lap strategic trap that Leclerc just set. You're just seeing a confusing, boring swap of places on his site.
I gotta imagine the broadcasters will figure that out eventually with new graphics. But we need to pivot to something much more immediate and honestly terrifying. The sheer danger we saw out there this weekend.
Yeah, the safety concerns are very real.
It wasn't just confusing overtakes. The start of the race looked like pure chaos. I was reading through the new launch procedures and the sources, and it sounds insanely convoluted. Can you walk us through what a driver actually has to do now just to get the car off the line?
It's intense. So the 2026 engine regulations removed some of the older MGUH hybrid components. Those used to naturally spool up the turbocharger. Without them, drivers now face severe turbo lag, a massive delay between pressing the throttle and the engine actually giving you power.
Which you absolutely cannot have when the lights go out.
Exactly. So to counteract this, the FIA introduced a new procedure. Drivers now have to manually spin the engine turbos before the lights go out.
Wait, manually? That sounds like a totally inexact science.
It is entirely inexact. There's this new 5-second pre-start window. The driver has to calculate exactly how much throttle to apply with their foot to keep the turbo spooled, but without cooking the clutch or causing massive wheel spin.
That is so much to manage while staring at the red lights.
And it gets worse. Because to add another layer of complexity, once those 5 red lights illuminate, the final hold time is entirely at the discretion of the start light operator. Leclerc actually mentioned the operator in Melbourne was being really cheeky with a surprisingly short hold.
Unbelievable. So if a driver misjudges that manual turbo spin by even a fraction of a second, what happens?
They bog down entirely. The car basically won't launch. And that leads directly to the terrifying safety hazards we saw on Sunday. Liam Lawson's car was practically stationary on the grid when the lights went out.
I saw that. Franco Colapinto was starting further back, already accelerating at race speed, and he had to pull off this miraculous split-second dodge to avoid rear-ending him.
Having cars launching at full speed, completely blind to a stationary vehicle ahead of them, it's one of the most hazardous scenarios in all of motorsport.
It really is. And Norris issued a stark warning about these speed differentials too, right? Not just at the start, but during the actual race.
Yes, and the FIA needs to take his warning seriously.
Yeah.
Because of that extreme difference between a car deploying electrical energy and a car that is harvesting, Norris noted sudden closing speeds of up to 50 kilometers per hour on the straights.
50 kilometers an hour difference.
Yeah. He explicitly warned that with differentials that severe, there's a real tangible risk of a car being launched over the catch fencing if a driver misjudges a closing gap.
That is chilling, just a terrifying prospect. But the safety anxieties didn't even end there. We have to talk about the active aero issues.
Oh, the straight mode zone.
Yes. The sources detail this mid-lap straight mode zone where the cars shift into a low downforce configuration. The FIA actually scrapped this zone before Free Practice 3 because of safety complaints, and then did a controversial U-turn and reinstated it. What makes this movable aero system so sketchy? I think Carlos Sainz called it really dangerous.
So straight mode is designed to reduce aerodynamic drag on the straights to save battery energy. The rear wing opens up, similar to DRS, but crucially, the front wing elements also adjust to shed drag.
Okay, so less drag, higher top speed. Sounds normal.
On its own, yes.
Yeah.
The problem, as George Russell pointed out, is the physics of dirty air. When you are following another car closely, the air coming off that lead car is incredibly turbulent.
Right.
When you enter straight mode while inside that turbulent air, your adjusted front wing loses almost all of its aerodynamic effectiveness. Russell reported having essentially zero front grip.
Zero front grip at over 300 kilometers an hour.
Exactly. If the front wheels aren't being pushed heavily into the tarmac by downforce, the driver literally cannot steer the car to avoid a sudden incident. It is a fundamental aerodynamic flaw with the 2026 concept that needs immediate addressing.
Okay, so despite all that chaos, the complex energy management, the terrifying speed differentials, the loss of steering in dirty air, someone still had to figure it out and win the race. And Mercedes seemed to navigate this new era better than anyone else in the grid. They secured a commanding 1-2 finish.
The W17 is an absolute masterpiece of engineering. They clearly interpreted the new aerodynamic and power unit regulations far more efficiently than the rest of the grid.
Without a doubt.
And honestly, the clearest indicator of their dominance wasn't even the race itself. It was qualifying. George Russell put that car on pole position with an 0.8 of a second gap to the nearest non-Mercedes car.
0.8. In modern Formula One, an 0.8 gap is an absolute eternity.
It's light years. It shows they have a profound understanding of how to balance that battery deployment over a single flying lap.
Russell drove a brilliant race, no taking away from his win. But the story that really stood out to me was on the other side of the Mercedes garage, Kimi Antonelli.
What a weekend for him.
We are talking about an 18-year-old rookie. He has a devastating crash in free practice 3, completely wrecking his car. The pressure of debuting in a totally new regulation era for a top-tier team is immense. How does a teenager mentally recover from putting it in the wall to finish second on Sunday?
It speaks volumes about his psychological resilience. You see it all the time. Young drivers spiral after a major error in practice. They get in their own heads, they overdrive the car on Sunday to compensate, and they make more mistakes.
Exactly.
But Antonelli showed immense maturity. Even when he had a poor launch at the start of the race and fell back into the pack, he didn't panic. He methodically managed his energy, picked off his rivals one by one, and fought his way back to the front. He didn't let the magnitude of the moment or the totally dominant pace of his veteran teammate overcome him.
And you have to contrast that methodical success with the atmosphere over at Ferrari. Because, man, it felt like a really bitter pill for the Scuderia to swallow. They had undeniable pace.
And they absolutely did.
Leclerc had that thrilling multi-lap battle for the lead with Russell, and Hamilton looked phenomenal in red, carving his way up to third early on. He genuinely looked thrilled to be fighting at the front again, but the pit wall let them down. Again, our sources point to a severe strategic blunder under the virtual safety car. Can you break down what went wrong?
It's a fascinating case study in risk management. When Isaac Hadjar's engine blew up, triggering that VSC, Mercedes instantly adapted. They called both Russell and Antonelli into the pits for a double-stack stop. They capitalized on the reduced time penalty of pitting while the rest of the field is driving slowly.
Right, standard VSC protocol for the leaders, but Ferrari, conversely, just froze.
Completely froze.
I was looking at the timeline and the analysis, and it seemed like Ferrari just stuck to their pre-race plan, regardless of the fact that the race dynamic had just violently shifted.
That is the core issue with their race operation. They had a pre-planned two-stop strategy, and they rigidly adhered to it. They didn't even try to split their strategy. Maybe bringing Leclerc in and leaving Hamilton out to cover their bases.
Put your eggs in two baskets.
Exactly. Instead, they kept both cars out on aging tires. So when they eventually had to pit under normal green flag racing conditions, the time loss relative to Mercedes was insurmountable. They simply couldn't catch the Mercs once they were on the hard compound tires.
So is this just a simple miscalculation in the heat of the moment, or is this indicative of a larger cultural issue at Ferrari? Because we've seen this movie before.
I think it points to a historical tendency at Ferrari to rely way too heavily on pre-race computer simulations rather than reading the dynamic, on-the-fly reality of the racetrack.
Like a sunk cost fallacy.
Exactly that. They invest so much time in the pre-race modeling that they are terrified to deviate from the script when an unpredictable variable like a sudden VSC emerges. They had a car fast enough to win that Grand Prix, but they lost it in the boardroom.
Brutal. Well, while the top teams were locked in that strategic battle, the midfield provided some incredible, fiery storylines. Audi's arrival was highly anticipated, taking over the Sauber operation. Now, Nico Hülkenberg couldn't start due to a mechanical issue, which is obviously not ideal, but their rookie, Gabriel Bortoleto, put on an absolute show.
Bortoleto's drive was stellar. He executed a brilliantly aggressive two-stop race to score points on his debut. He was not intimidated at all.
No, he wasn't.
But if we look at the bigger picture of Audi's entry, what is most impressive to me is this serious, aggressive DNA they have brought to the grid immediately.
Right. They didn't just show up to sell road cars.
Exactly. Sometimes manufacturers enter F1 as a branding exercise, and they bring these very conservative, safe designs. Audi built a radical aerodynamic platform and a highly competitive in-house power unit completely from scratch. They demonstrated pure intent from lap 1.
We also saw phenomenal drives from the RB and Haas camps. Arvid Lindblad, making his debut for RB, became the third youngest driver in history to score points, and he was actually defending against Max Verstappen at one point.
Which takes some serious nerve.
And Ollie Bierman over at Haas executed a flawless overcut strategy on the Alpines. Why did the overcut work so well for Bierman while his own teammate Ocon was struggling back in the pack?
It comes right back to the dirty air problem we discussed with the active aero. While Ocon was caught up in skirmishes, degrading his tires in the turbulent wake of the cars ahead, Bierman found clean air.
Ah, smart.
He managed his tire temperatures perfectly, which allowed him to extend his stint. By the time the cars ahead of him pitted, Bierman could unleash all his saved battery and his preserved tire grip, pump in massive fast lap times, and then pit later, rejoining the track ahead of them. It was a remarkably intelligent drive for such a young guy.
Now, we've covered the triumphs, we've covered the strategic chess matches, but we have to dedicate time to the darker side of the grid today, because for some teams, Melbourne was an unmitigated disaster. Let's start with McLaren.
Yeah, it was a very sobering weekend for the team and Papaya.
I mean, the most shocking moment of the whole weekend was Oscar Piastri. He is at his home Grand Prix. The grandstands are packed with Aussies, and he crashes on the formation lap before the race even starts. The sources mentioned something about the electrical system causing it. What actually happens mechanically to cause a world-class driver to spin under safety car speeds?
It really highlights a unique, aggressive challenge of these 2026 power units. With a traditional internal combustion engine, the power delivery builds on a curve. You press the throttle, the revs build, and the power is delivered progressively to the rear wheels. Exactly. Electrical energy, however, is instantaneous. The sources indicate Piastri experienced a sudden torque spike, a massive, immediate burst of power from the electrical system. Because his tires were cold and lacked grip on that slow formation lap, that sudden torque immediately overwhelmed the rear tires. It just snapped the car directly into the wall.
Man, that is a brutal error.
It is, but it underscores how violently these new power units deliver their energy. It caught him completely off guard.
And the pain for McLaren didn't end in the wall. Lando Norris crossed the finish line an agonizing 51 seconds behind Mercedes. In a race that featured a virtual safety car bunching up the field, being nearly a minute down is alarming.
It suggests a fundamental systemic issue with their car design. It could be massive aerodynamic drag, but more likely their energy deployment mapping is highly inefficient, meaning Norris is forced to harvest energy far more often than his rivals, losing huge chunks of time on the straights.
Red Bull also had a severe reality check. Max Verstappen crashed out in Q1, started way back in 20th, and managed to claw his way to 6th. But reading the radio transcripts from the sources, he sounded absolutely miserable in that cockpit. He was constantly fighting battery issues.
He was reporting zero electrical deployment on the opening laps. When you combine Verstappen's software issues with his teammate Isaac Hadjar suffering a catastrophic internal combustion engine failure, it paints a very worrying picture for Milton Keynes.
Because they're building their own engine now.
Right. Red Bull has built their own power unit in-house for the very first time. It appears to have some raw pace, but it is incredibly fragile. We are seeing a return to an era where mechanical reliability is just as crucial as aerodynamic downforce.
Which brings us to Williams. We briefly touched on them earlier, but Carlos Sainz had a nightmare scenario. He suffered a front wing actuator failure. That means the mechanism that physically moves the active aero broke, correct?
Yes. The flap simply couldn't adjust properly. This meant he was stuck with an unbalanced aerodynamic profile for the race, which destroyed his tires prematurely. He was essentially just driving an extended, very slow practice session.
Just trying to survive.
Exactly. Plus, the sources note the Williams chassis is drastically overweight, which is a lethal penalty when energy management is so critical. Every extra kilogram drains your battery faster. They have a mountain to climb.
But listen, according to all our sources, the absolute heaviest critique, the most systemic, embarrassing failure of the weekend, belongs to Aston Martin and Honda. One analyst literally gave Honda a 0 rating.
A 0. And honestly, it is difficult to overstate how poorly their weekend went. Fernando Alonso had an incredible start, jumping from 17th up to 10th, but it was entirely futile.
Right, because both he and his teammate Lance Stroll suffered DNF retirements.
Their engines were throwing anomalous data readings left and right, forcing the team to park the cars just to prevent complete internal destruction.
And the context behind this failure is what really caught my eye in the research. The sources revealed that when Aston Martin's leadership visited the Honda facility in Japan last November, they found a startling lack of personnel. Only 30% of the original F1 staff from Honda's highly successful era with Red Bull were actually assigned to this new 2026 engine project. How does a management failure of that magnitude even occur?
It is a staggering lack of foresight. Aston Martin is pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into a state-of-the-art wind tunnel and a massive factory in Silverstone. They're building a world-class chassis infrastructure, but an F1 car is a symbiotic machine.
The engine has to match the aero.
Exactly. If the manufacturer providing your power unit hasn't committed the necessary engineering resources to develop these highly complex 2026 electrical systems, your aerodynamic investments are completely worthless. Honda severely underestimated the complexity of the new regulations, and Aston Martin failed to secure the necessary oversight to catch it. It is a profound organizational disconnect.
Wow. So we've unpacked the highly engineered cat-and-mouse overtakes, the very real dangers of turbo lag and active aero, the strategic blunders from Ferrari, and the mechanical heartbreaks down the grid. Bringing this all together, what is the ultimate takeaway for the listener who is planning to follow this season?
The paradigm of Formula One has fundamentally shifted, and your viewing habits need to shift right along with it. You can no longer watch a race simply looking for who breaks the latest at the end of a long straight. You have to watch anticipating a long-term resource management game.
It's a completely different sport.
It is. It is about identifying who is quietly saving their battery while sitting in a slipstream and who is burning their tires early to make a flashy but ultimately useless pass. The sport has evolved into a deeply cerebral, highly strategic battle of total efficiency.
It really is an entirely new language of racing, which leaves you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends. As these cars become incredibly complex, software-managed energy platforms demanding constant calculation and resource allocation, will the champion of this new 2026 era be the driver with the most raw, instinctual racing talent, or simply the one who is the smartest gamer of the system?
That is the defining philosophical question of this new era.
It's going to be a wild ride finding out.
It absolutely is. Thank you so much for joining us in the DRS zone for this deep dive. Keep questioning the mechanics of the sports you love. Keep an eye on how technology shifts the boundaries of competition. And hey, make sure you follow DRS Zone on all platforms, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube so you never miss an update. We will catch you next time.